Just to reiterate the question, how many migrants, illegal migrants, were deported to Rwanda during the period in which you were in government? This started in
Well,
2018. You had sort of 6 years to do it. So how many migrants were deported?
basically zero, because
Zero.
the scheme...
Not basically zero, it was zero,
It
wasn't
was
it?
zero. Well, the 4 people went voluntarily, but let's just say zero.
How much will a Conservative government reduce net migration by?
Well, we intend to get the levels down by an enormous amount compared to where they've been in recent years, because we've got to start by just being honest. Under successive governments, including, just to be honest, the last Conservative government, migration into this country, legal migration, has been far, far too high. It's put pressure on public services, it's put community cohesion under massive, massive strain because much of the recent migration has not integrated. And actually, it's costing taxpayers money. Some people in the past have claimed that mass migration is good for the economy. It turns out actually it's not good for the economy because a large proportion of people that have come in for the primary purpose of not working. And even those who are working, around half are on low incomes where they don't actually make a contribution. So we're going to get these numbers down a long way. The mechanism we're going to use to do that is we're going to have a binding annual cap set by Parliament each year in a democratic vote. It'll set a limit, and when that limit gets hit, it'll turn into a monthly limit. The government will just stop issuing visas. We're going to unveil in the relatively near future where we think that level should be, but it'll be a lot lower than anything we've seen in recent years.
Can you remind us of the promises the Conservatives made in 2010, in 2015, in 2017 and 2019 when it came to immigration?
So the Conservative governments in the 2010s said they would get migration down to below 100,000, into the tens of thousands. Now, while we were and that promise was not delivered, I'm going to be honest, right? That promise was not delivered. When in the European Union, that was because free movement meant actually no government could limit immigration from the EU. The Cameron government, interestingly, did manage to limit immigration from outside the EU. There was a 20,000 cap, and that was successfully implemented, but they couldn't do it for EU citizens, and that's why the numbers were so high through the 2010s. After COVID, the way the so-called points-based system was set up was, I'm just going to be completely honest, it was far too lax. The rules were set in a way that just let in, way too many people. That was a really bad mistake. I'm just going to be honest about that. That was a really bad mistake. That should never have happened. And that's why we need this mechanism of a binding cap voted on by Parliament. So it's completely transparent to the public, to everybody. Every single MP is going to have to account to their constituents for how they vote on that cap. And it means never again can we see numbers turning out to be way higher than anyone wanted or promised or expected. That can just never happen again.
So four broken promises in each of those manifestos. So why should we believe you on the fifth?
Because firstly, we've got new leadership, we've got a new leader. I'm new as Shadow Home Secretary. We've got a new approach. We've been honest, as I have just been with you, about where those catastrophically bad mistakes were made. We've been totally honest about that. And we've got a specific, credible plan to fix it. And as time goes on, that plan is going to grow in its level of detail. We're the only party in Parliament who are coming up with these detailed, credible ideas, by the way. So that mechanism for a cap that I just mentioned, that's not just an idea. We've turned that into legislative drafting. We've tabled amendments in Parliament to create that cap mechanism. We did the thinking to draft it and all the rest of it, but the Labour government voted against it. So we're the ones doing the kind of detailed thinking to figure out how to fix these problems. And they are really serious problems.
Why did your government between 2020 and 2024 let in 1 million Indians to Britain?
Well, you would have to ask the ministers who took those decisions. The numbers that in total were far too high, in my view. I've explained why already. Social cohesion, mass low-skilled migration doesn't actually add to the economy. I should say that limited amounts of high-skill migration does add to the economy. So if people want to come here and work in IT, financial services, scientific research, those kind of like highly paid, high value adding professions, like limited numbers of people in those areas, I think that is a good thing. But mass low skilled migration, which I'm afraid is what we've seen, just cannot happen again.
You say I should ask the ministers. I mean, you were a minister in the Home Office in Boris Johnson's government, working under Priti Patel, focusing on illegal migration. I know that wasn't legal, but you were part of that government. You were part of various Conservative governments in that period. in which 1 million Indians were allowed into Britain against your manifesto pledge.
Yeah, so I was not responsible for legal migration, as you say, and I therefore didn't get cited on any of those papers. When anyone did ask my opinion, I said I thought migration should come down. And I remember when I was in the Treasury briefly, and the then Home Secretary Suella Braverman wanted to reduce migration. Traditionally, the Treasury has been resistant to that, but I said to her, "Look, if you want to put through measures to reduce migration, you're not going to have any objections at all from me." One of the problems is that the sort of economic orthodoxy in the UK, by which I partly mean the Treasury, but also just the sort of wider group of economic forecasters, had this dogma that net migration was like good for the economy. Now it turns out that is not true. Certain specific types of migration, like high-skilled people, like I say, working in finance, scientific research, that artificial intelligence, that's fine. That is good for the economy. But mass low-skilled migration actually isn't, because workforce participation is actually very low among some of these nationalities, and people working on lower wages, like for example £20,000 a year, and people were allowed in to work on those wages, actually take more in public services or consume more in public services than they pay in tax. So this idea that's been prevalent for the last 10, 20 years that any net migration is good for the economy, turns out it's completely untrue.
So you supported Boris Johnson, you supported Priti Patel, you supported all of these people who let in hundreds of thousands of people, again breaking that manifesto pledge. A few other nationalities: 450,000 Nigerians, 289,000 Pakistanis, 84,000 people from Ghana, 93,000 people from Zimbabwe. In total, 750,000 people from the African sub-Sahara, 100 and more than 100,000 Bangladeshis. This came in between 2020 and 2024, plus the million Indians, record numbers of immigration. You supported these ministers, you supported the Prime Minister, and you say you have a new team in the shadow cabinet. The shadow Foreign Secretary is Priti Patel. She is the woman, as Home Secretary, who oversaw the numbers that I'm talking about. So how can you sit here and say, you're going to reduce these migration numbers with this cap and so on, when you were part of the government, you supported these ministers, and you have Priti Patel as the shadow Foreign Secretary?
Look, Kemi and I were not Prime Minister. We weren't Home Secretary. We weren't Chancellor in the previous governments. And Kemi and I have both been really clear.
Priti was, though.
That what happened, I think Priti has been clear as well now, that what happened in those years was a mistake. It shouldn't have happened. And we've not only come up with some specific ideas like the migration cap to make sure it never happens again, we've also actually gone further and come up with ideas about how to deal with people that have come into the country during the period you just referenced, particularly 2020 to 2024, but more widely as well, who've come here and either have not worked when they were supposed to come here to work, or who have come here and worked on low wages where they're not making a contribution, or where they've come here and effectively claim benefits. Now, for those people, come here and not worked, earn low wages, or even claim benefits, when their visa comes to be renewed, because they're on temporary visas, typically 3 or 5 years, in my view, if they're not making a contribution, those visas should not be renewed, and they should be required to leave. And sort of further to that, for people that have come here and not made a contribution, then they should not be able to get indefinite leave to remain, which, as the name implies, means you can basically stay here forever. So those are some ideas we've developed to deal with people that have come here in the last 4 or 5 years and have not made an economic contribution, which is a large number of people. They shouldn't ultimately stay, because if somebody comes here saying they're going to work, saying they're going to make a contribution, but then doesn't, then I think it's reasonable that we say, well, look, you came here to work, you haven't done that, so you've got to leave when your visa expires. So, and again, we tabled all of this as amendments to legislation in Parliament just a few months ago, and Labour voted it down. So we've done the work to figure out how to effectively fix some of the problems, really serious problems that occurred in the last few years.
Just coming back to Priti Patel, she was responsible for migration as Home Secretary for much of this period. You say she's changed her views on this issue. Last year she gave an interview to Harry Cole where she said the wave of migrants that came under her leadership and Boris Johnson's leadership, the so-called Boris wave, were the best and brightest coming into Britain. She remains the shadow Foreign Secretary. Again, there doesn't seem to be any break from that period in which millions of people flooded into the country and your current shadow cabinet.
Well, I think she clarified those remarks subsequently, and I don't think I can have been clearer in my comments just now. And it's not just that I've said what happened previously was a mistake, a really big, serious mistake, but we've got specific and credible plans, not just to stop it happening again, but to fix what's happened already. Now, there is only one party in Parliament who has done that detailed work. Now, I know Reform talk a very good game. Nigel Farage is charismatic, I'll give him that. They've got good slogans. Right? What they haven't done, what Reform hasn't done, is come up with these detailed ideas that we have to basically fix these problems going forward. And that is the difference between us, and that's the new approach we're taking.
Isn't the actual difference between you and Reform that you are the only party that has let in 1 million Indians, 500,000 Nigerians, 300,000 Pakistanis, 84,000 people from Ghana, 93,000 from Zimbabwe, and so on? That's the real difference.
Well, I've said repeatedly, and Kemi has said, we both gave a speech on this back in November within a few weeks of her being elected leader and me being appointed Shadow Home Secretary. We gave a speech probably not more than 200 yards from where we're sitting right now, explaining that was a mistake. We've got new leadership and we're taking a different approach. And I've set out in detail over the last 10, 15 minutes what that different approach is.
Do you support remigration schemes that we've seen in the US and Sweden, where they're beginning to offer migrants a financial incentive to leave the country? So in Sweden, I think it's something like $30,000 coming in next year to low-wage and unemployed migrants. In the US, $1,000 for illegal migrants to self-deport.
Yeah, so broadly speaking, yes. I think people who are here illegally should be deported straight away. People who are foreign nationals, so a citizen of another country who commit a criminal offence, should all be deported. And we should disapply the Human Rights Act, so we can't have any disapply modern slavery legislation, so we don't have any vexatious legal challenges which allow dangerous foreign criminals to stay, which has been routinely happening. And then for people who have come here to work but who haven't worked or are working on low wages, when their visa expires, we should be requiring them to leave, not asking nicely, requiring people to leave who are not making a contribution. That's all sort of hard-edged measures. I've got no problem with offering some financial incentives to just speed that process up and make it a bit easier, but ultimately we need the backstop of compulsory deportation if people are here illegally, if they've committed a criminal offence and they're a citizen of another country, or if their visa has expired and the government choose not to renew that visa. That should not be optional. People who have no legal right to be here or who have committed a criminal offence should be deported.
Okay, let's talk about illegal migration. You were a minister, as I said, under Boris Johnson's government, where you focused in part again on illegal migration. Since 2018, more than 184,000 people have crossed the English Channel in small boats illegally. Almost all of them came under the Conservative government, came under the period in which you were a minister responsible for this. How many of them were deported to Rwanda in that time?
So let me just start with the background facts, then we'll come on to Rwanda in a second. So it's not true to say that almost all of them came under the last government. I think somewhere in the region of between 50 and 55,000 have come since the election.
150,000 came in under your government. That's almost all.
Let me just finish the point. So the numbers, it should be zero, frankly. Now, in 2023, which was our last full year in office, we actually got the numbers down by about a third because, for example, we started returning people to Albania. That was at the time the biggest nationality. So we got those numbers down by a third. Now, we then had the Rwanda scheme that you just referenced, whereby everybody arriving illegally across the channel would be immediately removed to Rwanda, which we designated a safe country. Now, there was two legal challenges to that. One in Strasbourg, the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, which I think was in about June 2022. There was a second challenge in the Supreme Court here in London, the UK Supreme Court, in about October 2023, which essentially struck down the scheme, said it was unlawful, using the European Convention on Human Rights. We then passed a law through Parliament in early 2024, the Safety of Rwanda Act, which basically sought to override those judgments. And the first plane was ready to go in fact, specifically on July the 24th last year, July the 24th, 2024. Now, the election happened before that. That was a mistake as well. We should have had the election afterwards. But we lost that election on July the 4th. And the first thing that Keir Starmer did pretty much when he was elected leader was cancel that Rwanda scheme literally 2 weeks before the first plane was due to take off. Now, it's my view that the deterrent effect of removing everybody who arrives would very rapidly, within a few months, 2-3 months, just stop people coming. In fact, we've seen that in America in the last 6 months since the new administration came in. We can talk about that in a minute. But the deterrent effect would mean, if you're an illegal immigrant in France, why would you cross to the UK if you know you're going to wind up in Rwanda? Australia did something very similar about 12, 13 years ago called Operation Sovereign Borders. They used a little island called Nauru rather than Rwanda, but the principle is the same, and they completely stopped illegal immigration by boat to Australia, they had about 50,000 a year coming, so similar levels to what we're seeing. They only actually had to remove, I think, 3 or 4,000 people before it just stopped completely. So it was a big mistake of Labour to do that with no replacement plan. What has happened since then is the numbers have surged back up. They've gone up by 38%, and this year so far has been the worst in history, for illegal immigrants
Well,
crossing
they were
the channel.
actually surging before the election as well last year in 2024. So, you had a
But
drop in 2023, but it also surged in
the
early
numbers
2024.
the numbers this year, 2025,
Sure.
are 38% higher than the same point in 2024, including those first 6 months you refer to.
So just to reiterate the question, how many illegal migrants, were deported to Rwanda during the period in which you were in government? This started in 2018. You had sort of 6 years to do it. So how many migrants were deported?
Basically zero, because
Zero.
the scheme...
Not basically zero, it was zero, wasn't it?
It was zero. Well, the 4 people went voluntarily, but let's just say zero. Because the scheme didn't start, right? Because of these legal challenges, I've mentioned the Strasbourg challenge and the UK Supreme Court challenge.
You had an 80-seat majority. You could have overturned these.
And we did, and we passed that law in early 2024.
You had 6 years to do it.
Look, we had one judgment in June 2022. We tried again, we got blocked in October 2023. We passed a law in the first half of 2024. We were ready to go by July 24. Now, could we have done that earlier? Yeah, frankly, it would have been good to have done it earlier. But we did all that stuff, and then Starmer cancelled it. And the reason that no one ended up going to Rwanda is because the scheme was cancelled by Keir Starmer, by Labour, like 2 weeks before it was due to start. So we're going to definitely bring that back.
So as I said, 150,000 came in illegally under the Conservative government. Many of these people went to hotels. Many of those hotels were luxury hotels. Obviously, people are rightfully furious about that. Billions of pounds being spent by taxpayers on housing migrants in hotels. Again, a Conservative scheme. I want to talk to you about a case of Thomas Roberts, a 21-year-old Royal Marine, who in March 2022 was stabbed in the heart by an illegal migrant who came in 2018, smuggled himself on a lorry into Britain under, again, Conservative government. This migrant had already killed 2 people in Serbia, had a history, obviously a criminal record.
And had lied about his age as well.
Had lied about his age, and the Home Office had failed to do multiple vetting checks. The Home Office put him into a school in Devon with Year 9 people. He carried knives, he attacked his foster mother. So many failings from the state. Failing to vet his age, failing to vet his background with his criminal record in Serbia. And Thomas Roberts paid with his life for that. Do you feel any kind of responsibility for Thomas Roberts' death and the countless others whose lives have been overturned, destroyed, even been killed by illegal migrants under the Conservative government under your watch?
Well, I think successive governments should have done a lot more to stop illegal immigration and to prevent that kind of person, the scumbag who did that, getting into the country, and to frankly then deport them when he got here. So that kind of person, that kind of scumbag, should not be allowed into the country. He murdered, as you say, a Royal Marine. I think it was in Bournemouth, wasn't it? It's just a sickening case. That's why we need a scheme like Rwanda to deport people, illegal immigrants, immediately upon arrival. You mentioned the age. It's why, because he basically, I think when he arrived, he claimed he was 14 and he was
19.
He was in fact 19. That's right. So we're the only European country not to use scientific age assessment techniques. So this is, for example, an X-ray of the wrist or of the teeth to determine age. There are now other techniques like facial recognition software, techniques like DNA methylation, and the measurement of iliac crest fusion, which measure age to within about a plus or minus 1 year accuracy. We're the only European country, the only one not to use scientific age assessment techniques. And again, Labour have just repealed some of the legislation that would have enabled, we introduced like late in our time in government, it would have enabled scientific age assessment techniques to stop people who are like sometimes in their 20s or even potentially as old as 30, pretending to be 17 and winding up in schools. So as I hear stories like this and cases like this, it makes me realise that the whole kind of human rights architecture, the Human Rights Act, a lot of like modern slavery legislation, all of these lawyers who say, oh, you can't x-ray people's wrists, they haven't given consent, all these arguments, it's like complete nonsense. And I don't think previous governments should have entertained those or tolerated those in the way they did. And it is in a sense.
Those are your governments.
They were.
Do you not feel a modicum of shame, regret, embarrassment, horror that this happened under your watch? Again, the legislation you're talking about in the Home Office to introduce, say, the proper age checks, you could have introduced that in a heartbeat. You had 14 years. Do you not feel... People are so angry about this stuff. The family of Thomas Roberts are angry that the state let them down. And this responsibility is on you. It's not on the human rights lawyers. It's on the Conservatives who had a majority in Parliament who could have solved these issues if they wanted to, and they didn't.
Yeah, so I think as I've said quite a few times, I do think previous governments, including the most recent Conservative one, should have taken a much, much tougher line on this. But the new leadership, like I wasn't Home Secretary, I wasn't Prime Minister, nor was Kemi. The new leadership,
Minister for Illegal Migration.
and we got the numbers down by a third in 2023. We had the Rwanda scheme ready to go. I mean, you could argue that should have been done a bit earlier, but we had to battle through 2 court cases in the Supreme Court and in Strasbourg, right? And we got the numbers down by a third, right? Since then, under Labour, they've surged because they cancelled the work we'd done. But look, a lot more should have been done, and now we've got new leadership and a new approach, and I've gone through in detail what that looks like, and it included, we haven't talked about this yet, but we would also get rid of the Human Rights Act for all immigration matters. This is a radical new approach, because the cases like the one you just mentioned, that should never have happened, and we've got to make sure it never happens again. And my observation from the last Conservative government is there is not a soft way of doing this. You've got to deal with these issues in, frankly, quite a hard way, and that includes stripping away a whole load of this legislation that was put in place in the past, like the Human Rights Act 1998, for I guess good reasons or for good intentions, but it's ended up getting misused. And there is no way you can kind of dance around that or try and... I was in Parliament yesterday debating with the new Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, and she was saying, we're going to make some little changes here and there to Article 8. Right, that's not going to work. Tinkering around the edges is not going to work. To be honest, the last government tried tinkering around the edges, and it doesn't work. You can't do that. It needs radical solutions, and that's what we've developed.
I think you criticise reform for talking a lot. It just feels to me that what you're saying, it feels like a lot of talk. I mean, like I say, the case of Thomas Roberts, this is a real man, a hero really, who was murdered by an illegal migrant who came under your watch. And so many state failings from the Home Office and so on, again, under Conservative government. I interviewed recently a victim of a migrant who raped this young girl, 20-year-old girl, in Oxford, a student. This illegal migrant came in, again, under your government, under your watch, was staying in a migrant hotel in Oxford near these students, near vulnerable people. She was just walking home after a night out, and a migrant grabbed and raped her in a graveyard and was sent to prison for up to 12 years, might be out in 8. This girl said to me, it feels like the migrant, it's his country, it's not my country. And she said she's terrified that once he comes out of prison, he might do it again. She said she may even leave the country. Again, it just feels to me like these are real life cases. These are human cases of what happened under your Conservative government. Again, I know I'm asking the same question, but do you not feel any shame about what happened there? These real disastrous consequences of your failure to action?
Look, I mean, I've said it several times, because you have asked the same question quite a few times. These were mistakes, right? People like that man should not have been allowed to stay in the country. He should have been deported immediately upon arrival. And that is our new approach. I mean, I said that in Parliament just yesterday. We've tabled legislation that would require people like that, illegal immigrants who arrive here, to be immediately deported. And when it comes to foreign criminals, like the man you just mentioned who committed that appalling rape of the student in Oxford, when his prison sentence is done, he should be immediately deported from the prison gate back to his country of origin, and no concocted asylum claim, human rights claim, or modern slavery claim, or frankly any other claim, should let that man stay in this country, because we owe it to the victim, the young girl, the student you mentioned, and frankly to the rest of society, to make sure that kind of person, that rapist, doesn't stay here, right? The laws as they stand can be abused to let people like him stay, and that's got to end. That's got to finish. I made that point in Parliament yesterday, and in fact we can see it playing out even today. As we sit here, this is the second day in a row when the government are supposed to have sent a very small number of illegal channel migrants back to France. Now it's a little gimmick because they're going to let 95% of them stay, but even the 5% they're proposing to remove, they haven't been able to do that yesterday. They failed again today because these human rights laws, modern slavery laws, are being abused. it's got to end. It's got to finish.
Okay, let's move on. So I want to talk about the demographic changes in Britain. Over the last 20, 30 years, we've seen a huge shift in ethnic demographics. I think from 2001, we had 87% of the country was white British. In 2021, this is according to the census, that's fallen to 74%. Is that a concern of yours in any way?
Yes, social cohesion is a concern, and the scale of migration has been so rapid, and there has been a failure to integrate in some cases. It does put huge pressure on social cohesion, which I think is deeply troubling. Let me just give you some sort of evidence in support of that. There are now, according to the 2021 census, the numbers have gone up since then, but according to the 2021 census, there were 1 million people in the UK who couldn't speak English at all or properly. There's a borough in East London where 73% of school children don't speak English as their first language. There are some nationalities, I think Somali, for example, where it's somewhere in the region of 3/4 of people with Somali nationality live in social housing. There are some nationalities where workforce participation, particularly for women, is extremely low. We know, for example, that Afghan nationals, people with an Afghan passport, are 22 times more likely to commit sex offences than people in the UK. So these are all concerns about public safety, about integration. I've made the point earlier about the economic impact of mass low-skill migration. It's not actually good for the economy at all. So for all of those reasons, I think the sheer numbers of people coming into the country over the last 20 odd years have been far too high.
In terms of the changing, again, ethnic demographics of Britain, this is unprecedented, this is historic, the rate of change. I mean, Britain has basically been ethnically homogenous for its entire history until really 1945 and accelerated massively in 1997 and accelerated again under Boris Johnson and your government. By 2063, Matthew Goodwin estimates that Britain will be minority white British. Are you worried about that? Are you worried about Britain becoming minority white British by 2063?
So I'm not sure. I don't know if I haven't looked at the forecast. The point I would make is a slightly different one, which is that we can't have mass migration has to stop because it's putting pressure on social cohesion. It's bad for the economy, and we're not seeing integration in all areas in the way that we'd want to. So the number has to come down a very, very long way for those reasons.
So you're not worried about the ethnic makeup of Britain, because many British people feel that their country is changing in an unprecedented way. They live in communities in which, again, were homogenous communities, homogenous societies, ethnically English, ethnically British, and those communities, those towns, those villages, those cities have changed vastly in a generation. Again, coming back to this issue, people are concerned that Britain will become minority white British within their lifetimes, within my lifetime. Why is that not a concern of yours?
I didn't say it wasn't a concern. What I said was
you didn't answer the question.
What I said was a concern is like mass immigration is a concern. That's got to stop. And a lack of integration isn't acceptable either, whether that's economic integration or cultural integration. We need a sense of shared identity. So, I mean, you're looking at it through a very specific lens. I'm looking at it through a slightly different lens. But the point is that I'm making is that mass migration has to stop.
Should we be importing people into Britain with ethnic conflicts or ethnic enemies?
Just expand that a little bit.
People who hate people or dislike people specifically because of their ethnicity. So, for example, radical people from Palestine who may hate people from Israel, and so on. People with ethnic enemies or ethnic conflicts.
So I think we need to make sure people who come into the country are going to make a positive, and the numbers should be very limited. Just to repeat that point, one of the issues is just the sheer numbers, right? They're far too high. They've got to come right down. In selecting who amongst those limited numbers we do want to come, it's got to be people who are going to make a contribution, and it's reasonable that we work out ways of sort of measuring or calculating who is going to make a contribution. Now, there's an obvious one dimension to that is economic, right? If people are going to come here, we want them to be working in like high skill jobs, like I've mentioned, like finance, scientific research, IT, artificial intelligence, those kind of fields where they're going to make a really significant economic contribution. So I think we should definitely have criteria around that. I think it is also reasonable to guard against like extremism. Now, I don't want to sort of paint entire nationalities or entire groups as extremists. I don't think it's wrong to do that, but we should be vigilant to where people come and have extremist views. And if someone appears to have extremist views, regardless of the community they're from, then I think we should be we shouldn't be letting people in who have extremist views, regardless of their background or which community they come from. I don't want to pick out particular communities and say all of those people are extremists. I don't think that's right. But we do want to make sure people with extremist views don't come in. And if people arrive here, and it turns out they have extremist views, then I think it is reasonable to remove them, as some other countries do.
So in an interview with The Spectator last year, your leader, Kemi Badenoch, I'm going to quote from this interview. "I find it interesting that everybody defines me as being Nigerian. I identify less with the country than with the specific ethnicity, that's the Yoruba. That's what I really am. I have nothing in common with the people from the north of the country, the Boko Haram, where the Islamism is. Those were our ethnic enemies, and yet you end up being lumped in with those people. Do you share your leader's thoughts about ethnic enemies in the north of Nigeria?"
Well, I certainly think that Boko Haram is a very dangerous organisation. If I recall correctly, they routinely kidnap young girls and hold them hostage. So I don't think any right-thinking person, would want to identify or associate with a dangerous group like Boko Haram.
But you wouldn't define a group like Boko Haram by their ethnicity, presumably.
I define them by their views.
Right.
The reason, so
but she calls them ethnic enemies.
Well, obviously, I'm not as familiar with how Nigeria works, how Nigerian people think about themselves and their fellow citizens. I've never even actually been to Nigeria, to be quite honest. What I would say is people with the views of Boko Haram, which is, as I understand it, an extremist organisation. Those are not, we don't want people.
But on
with those
principle,
views
do you
here.
think people can have ethnic enemies? Do you think that that's a legitimate position?
No, I don't. No, I think that's.
Do you disagree with Kemi then?
No, I don't. I think that people have their identity; they're entitled to it. But I don't think we should lapse into treating entire groups of people the same based on, for example, where they come from. But we should. It is reasonable to say if someone has extremist views, and I think anyone who's part of Boko Haram, if I've understood Boko Haram correctly, it is.
Well, they're a terrorist organisation.
Yeah, exactly.
Again, I'm going to quote from Kemi. Those were our ethnic enemies. I mean, that's such a strange use of language. It sounds like you don't agree with it.
Look, to be honest with you, I'm not going to pretend to understand how people feel about their identity in Nigeria, having never been there. So I'd defer to Kemi on that question.
Do you think there are too many people in Parliament who are representing the interests of other nations and not Britain? For example, people obsessed with Palestine and Gaza and so on.
I think representatives here should be thinking first and foremost about the United Kingdom. Our first duty is to the country we represent, the UK. Of course, we should try and use our influence as a G7 member, a permanent member of the Security Council. Right, that does carry with it, wider responsibilities as a developed country with a big military, and as I say, permanent seat at the UN Security Council. And we should try to de-escalate conflicts, address humanitarian crises. It's reasonable that we do that. But we should be mindful, I think, that our primary responsibility is to the welfare of the United Kingdom.
Okay, so again, I'm quoting from Kemi Badenoch. This is from 2010 in her blog. She wrote, "So I am..."
2010, did you say?
2010, when she first comes to Parliament. So I'm asking...
She wasn't in Parliament until 2017. So...
When she was trying to be elected to
Okay.
Parliament in London, I think. I think it was in Greenwich, right? I mean, I can't remember the exact seat. "So I'm asking for your help now to support a Nigerian who is trying to improve our national image and do something great here." Again, people have raised concerns that Kemi is focused on, these quotes about being a Nigerian, representing Nigeria in Parliament and so on. Shouldn't we be focused on Britain and Britain alone?
Well, look, I think people obviously have their own identities, right, based on their own backgrounds, and it's people do refer to those. And I don't think Kemi having her background in any way detracts from her ability to be a patriot and a strong voice for the UK. I mean, no one looking at Kemi's record in government and before being in government would say she's anything other than a very energetic patriot for our country.
Would you welcome Boris Johnson back into the Commons as a Conservative MP?
Well, as I understand it, he hasn't expressed any desire to come. So, I mean,
But on principle, would that be a good idea?
that sounds like a hypothetical, which I'm not going to get into.
Okay. You admit the Tory party made mistakes on immigration. Is there any other mistakes you think the Tory party made in that 2010 to 2024?
The other, if I'm going to be honest about it, the other thing that I think I would want to see a future Conservative government do differently is the level of taxation, which I think is too high. Now that means taking difficult decisions on spending, particularly welfare spending, which is far too high. There are way too many people in the UK who are benefit dependent, who are of working age, could work, should work, but aren't working. So we've got to be honest with the British public that to get taxes down, we need to control welfare spending. And again, like Labour are not going to do that. They had a little try at it a few months ago. Lucky enough, it was in June, and Keir Starmer had to do a humiliating U-turn because he was too weak to even control his own backbenchers. And in fact, the bill they ended up passing actually is going to increase welfare spending, not reduce it. And for some reason that I don't fully understand, Reform don't seem interested in reducing welfare expenditure either. So I'd like to see us control welfare expenditure to enable us to reduce taxes. I think taxes have been too high. They're obviously under Labour even higher because in the last budget in I think it was October last year, Rachel Reeves put through the biggest tax rises in a generation, and it looks like she's going to do the same again in November. So if we're going to have a dynamic, competitive, entrepreneurial economy, we need to get our taxes down. But to be honest with the public, we need to front up. That does mean controlling expenditure.
Is diversity a strength?
Is diversity a strength? I think it depends what you mean by diversity. I think we need, if you're talking about again the immigration question, the numbers need to be like far lower. We need people to be integrated, to feel first and foremost a sense of unity with and allegiance to the United Kingdom. We need people to be making an economic contribution. Those are the kind of tests I would set out.
I'm going to end with an easy question. So I asked Liz Truss this last year, and she gave quite an interesting answer. When it comes to Conservative politics, Conservative history, who is your favourite Tory leader, excluding Kemi through history, and also excluding Churchill and Thatcher? Those are the two obvious ones. I just wondered, are there any other Conservative leaders throughout the past that you look up to, that you admire, who are your favourite?
Yeah, so I would obviously have gone to Thatcher and Churchill first. Churchill for his inspirational war leadership, particularly in 1940, when a very dark shadow fell across Europe, and Churchill and the UK stood almost alone against the tyranny of Nazi Germany. And Thatcher, for the obvious reasons, turning around the country after the disaster of the late 1970s. A disaster, by the way, the current Labour government seem to be in the process of recreating. So we're going to need another decade of modern Thatcherism in the 2030s, in the same way as we had in the 1980s. But outside of those two, let me think. I think I would certainly say Nigel Lawson in the 1980s. What he did with the economy, I think was incredible. So and that's, I guess, part of Thatcherism, but I'd particularly pick out Nigel Lawson. I think going back to the 19th century, I would point to Benjamin Disraeli, because he set out a vision for conservatism. The idea of, I know today One Nation conservatism is seen as being like softened to the left, but he said, look, conservatism is for the whole country. And he was very much a patriot, Disraeli, and wanted to unite the entire country. And I think that concept, uniting the entire country under the same sort of vision, the same identity, I think that kind of leadership is required. So I think that Disraelian vision of a united country, a brand of conservatism that everyone can get behind, I think is something we could do with. I don't endorse the term. The word "one nation" has come to mean a sort of soft version of conservatism, which I don't really particularly subscribe to. Just to be clear on that. Are there any others I could particularly think of? Those are probably the.
Some people
two
talk
others.
about Baldwin in the 1920s, Lord Salisbury in the late 19th century.
Baldwin was sort of solid, wasn't he? He was kind of solid and sort of unspectacular. I suppose he represented stability, but I think the times we now live in, the challenges are so great. We need something a bit more like dynamic and energetic than the sort of stability that Baldwin. I mean, I think someone like Stanley Baldwin is good in sort of peaceful, easy times, but our times are not easy, and probably we need some slightly more radical solutions to fix the problems, both economic and otherwise, immigration that our country faces.
All right, Chris, you passed the exam. Thank you so much for
Did
joining
I?
us.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
All right.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.